His foreparents came to America on immigrant ships. My foreparents came to America on slave ships. But whatever the original ships, we're in the same boat tonight.
She's the daughter of June and Carlos. She's the mother of Naomi. She's the author of the new book, Jesse Jackson and the Fight for Black Political Power. She's also the host of the show that makes you want to throw your remote at the television screen. We're going to get into that in just a second. She's my friend, CNN Newsnight anchor, Abby Phillip. Abby, so good to see you. Thank you for hopping on the program with me.
Hey, thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Abby. And you know what? Let's get into this book because I want to give you some backstory and context here. First off, I happen to know Santita Jackson. She's a friend of mine. I've been on her radio show out in Minnesota, and we've done some stuff with the Free and Equal Elections Foundation. Actually texted her yesterday to see how her father was doing. The Reverend and I share the same birthday, October 8th. A great day. Nick Cannon also as well. So do with that as you want, information-wise. But in terms of writing about Jesse Jackson, because throughout my life and even talking to my dad, who's a Carlos, by the way, asking him about times that he saw the Reverend speak when he worked for his local unions with my mother back in the Bronx and in New York City, I was like, Jesse Jackson was always like a fixture in American politics around that time. I was born in 81, right? But then in something in your book talks about how it's kind of fizzled away from even mentioning Jesse Jackson, or at least people knowing about Jesse Jackson. So what made you want to write this book now about the Reverend?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's that some of it is that, right? That if you were around in the 80s, Jesse Jackson was definitely a major kind of celebrity figure. He was a fixture, as you said, in politics, but really just in public life. I also think, though, there are a lot of people who really their point of reference for him is sort of 2000 and onward, when they see him sort of showing up at political events, but not necessarily being a participant in the way that he was in the 80s. And one of the interesting things about these campaigns is the way in which it really kind of started off a whole generation of politics, particularly among Democrats, from the operatives who worked for him all the way to the political principles that underlie these campaigns. And I think that is the part that I don't think people really know all that much about. Like, they know he ran for president. I'm not sure that they know what he ran on. And one of the things about writing this was to draw the line, the connective tissue, not just between Jesse Jackson and like a Barack Obama, for example, but also a Jesse Jackson and a Bernie Sanders, a Jesse Jackson and an AOC or a Zohran Mamdani. And these are the types of, I think, political figures who are kind of taking up the mantle that he carried in the 80s and bringing it into modern times. And I think that history is not as well understood.
Yeah, and there's a great quote from Bernie Sanders, and I'll do the impression here for you, Abby, because I know you love to laugh. He is one of the most influential figures of our life in 100 years, right? Something like that, to that
Right.
effect.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. It sounded just like that. So let me ask you, because I love asking authors this, and I had Jake on recently. We were talking about his book. In your book, there's passages where obviously you're going to see the Reverend back in South Carolina, I believe, and he recognizes you as he's getting there older in age. So in terms of the research process of this, take people inside this book, like how you formulated this, talking about not only his upbringing and all the stuff in Greenville, but then working for Dr. King, everything leading up to the connective tissue, like you said, about him and Barack Obama. Tell us how you went about going about the research for this.
Well, there's, first of all, Jesse Jackson, the man. And I think it's hard to understand him as a person if you don't understand where he came from. And he came from, the sort of Jim Crow South Carolina, from, an unwed teen mother. And that part of his story, you kind of have to tell that in order to understand the building blocks of who he eventually became. And so, the book is cobbles together a lot of different types of reporting, a lot of sort of existing work that's out there about, about his upbringing, his childhood, things that he's talked about in the past. And then when I started writing this book, one of the first things I did was talk to him because, as he's been battling what they thought was Parkinson's, but is a slightly different variation of a neurodegenerative disorder for about 10 years now. And I was writing the book right in the middle of that. And so he was, I think it was getting harder to speak. It was getting harder for him to walk, to move around. And it was really important to try to get to him and some of these recollections directly from him as early as I could in the book. And a lot of it was just understanding his rationale for what he thought politics should be. And so the book is a combination of a lot of research, a lot of archival research, a lot of conversations with him, and a lot of conversations with people around him, including his family and his staff, and trying to paint a picture of what wasn't reported on at the time. Because one of the most striking things to me was he was running for president, and there was not, I mean, I think there was some coverage of him, but it was all very kind of one dimensional. It was all like, what does Jesse want? It was very dismissive, I think, in tone and in nature, essentially characterizing him as, a kind of flash in the pan type of candidate. And so I wanted to get beyond that and try to understand what was really happening in the campaign. What were people thinking about? What were some of the sort of internal ups and downs? And in order to get that up, in part because of his health, I had to speak with a lot of people in and around those campaigns who worked with him and knew him well. And so the book is all of that research that has come together.
One of the things you just kind of mentioned there, and Santita mentioned it, they got a quote attributed to her from CBS News when she was in the hospital, I think just a day or two ago. And she said, Dad still wants us to continue to fight. And you kind of talked about this line between, and you talk about it in the book with Biden, with the centrist Democrat mindset, the squad with the progressive mindset. And then I started thinking to myself as I was writing up questions for you last night, I'm like, but the Democrats are fighting right now over this party and what the party looks like and who can actually be the opposition, for lack of a better term, to Donald Trump. Because Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jamie Raskin threw her a lifeline to come into the Democratic Party. So when you were talking to the Reverend, this is a two-parter, which is the worst thing to do in journalism. The first part is, what does he think of modern day Democratic Party leadership and where it should head directionally? But then the second part is, we're seeing a lot of figures now. Just look at, you went on Pod Save America with John Favreau. Those guys were all Obama staffers, right? They have become a prominent voice in the progressive movement, right? Tim Miller, who used to work for Jeb Bush, now he's a prominent voice in Democratic politics. He was always in Republican. So you're starting to see a rise of like a lot of strategists, and now they're podcasters starting to cross over into this movement. Did you ever ask him about that and the way new media has kind of shaped Democratic voices and now lending to people like me who can actually influence potentially next candidates?
I mean, I definitely think he had a lot of thoughts about the current political environment, especially the Trump of it all and what the Democratic response should be to it. And I think he saw very clearly that what Trump was doing politically was trying to appeal to this sort of fundamentally, it's an economic discontent that manifests in a lot of different ways. On the right side of it, the Trump side of it, it's essentially they're taking from you. It's us against them. It's the immigrants who are taking your jobs and lowering your wages, and the factories are going overseas. And I think Reverend Jackson saw that clearly for what it was, which is a version of populism. And I think that what he argued back when he ran and when he was engaging in politics in the 2020s and 2020, as you may remember, he endorsed Bernie Sanders in that campaign. And what he saw was that Democrats needed to actually respond directly to that, to recognize and acknowledge that sense of economic discontent and address it head on. And I think that he one of the big misconceptions about him was that he was uh, arguing for politics that was kind of um, based on based solely on race or class or gender or whatever. This sort of identity politics that I think we're used to now. And in fact, even while he was very he recognized and acknowledged all of the constituent groups of the Democratic Party. The kind of politics that he was actually arguing for was one in which all of those different groups united underneath an umbrella of, you know, economic solidarity. And I definitely think he felt like that was missing. And so, look, it's not, I don't think that there's a sort of panacea here for politics, right? But I think he felt like, at least in 2020, that the person who was carrying that message forward the best was Bernie Sanders. That's why he endorsed him. He endorsed him in Michigan, which is a very significant place for Jesse Jackson in his 1988 campaign. And I also think that, look, the Obama era is actually not quite that kind of politics. I mean, Obama is much more of a centrist figure than a progressive, you know, left wing politician. And so some of these alums who've come out of that tradition, I think, are adjusting to these new times that we're in, where Trump has changed the political calculus and I think has required a different kind of political response. And I mean, in a way, I think Jesse Jackson would actually thrive in this kind of media environment, frankly, because he didn't have that in the 80s. In the 80s, it was like, the three networks and CNN had just come into being, and there were no places outside of that for him to go with his message. And I think that there is actually a real opportunity, as we've seen with a lot of kind of insurgent candidates, to use new media and social media to their advantage, to go directly to people. And the vehicle for that is some of these figures that you named, who are just as influential as the so-called mainstream media.
This episode of Can We Please Talk is presented by our friends over at Fresh Roasted Coffee. Delicious tasting coffee since 2009. They've been our proud sponsor. You see the promo code there. Look at this. They sent me this beautiful kit right here. Listen to that. Listen to that seal coming out, right? What's in it? Environmentally safe, compostable K-Pods. I love the dark Mexican blend. You can go to their website right now, take the quiz. That quiz is going to put you with a flavor profile. Listen to that sound of the coffee that you're going to be matched up with. Go to freshroastedcoffee.com. Click the link right now in our show notes. You can see it right there. Click that link. It's going to take you to the site. When you get to checkout, use our promo code, Can We Please Get 20? All one word, Can We Please Get 20, 20. You're going to get 20% off your first purchase. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com, our official sponsor of the Can We Please Talk podcast. And it's one thing I want to piggyback on that you just said there was about the Rainbow Coalition that he wanted to really put together. It was really around the economic solidarity. But let me pick apart something and ask you, did you ever ask the Reverend what he makes of Black political figures now? Because we just talked about Obama, and there's a chapter in your book obviously dedicated to that through line with the first Black president versus the first person to really run and be a major figure running for president as a Black man. But what does he make now of the current state of Black leaders? We're seeing some emerging figures. Wes Moore comes to mind. Obviously, we had Jamal Bowman's a friend of mine, and Cori Bush that's running again in Missouri. Like, what does he make of the Black leaders that are influencing Democratic politics right now? Is there anyone that he really points to and says, that person embodies what I ran on and the spirit of what I ran on?
In terms of specific names, he didn't talk to me specifically about, especially because some of these conversations happened sort of prior to this moment. But I mean, he's extremely supportive of Black political leadership. I mean, that's his whole bread and butter, was fighting for Black representation in this country. And so all of those people, I think, represent to him a kind of advancement of what he was fighting for since the 1960s, essentially. And I think particularly he recognized that some of the the voices in the Democratic Party. You named some, squad, I guess, current former squad members. Not sure if they're quite the squad anymore because some of them are no longer in Congress. But um, some of those figures, I think, came to prominence because of their willingness to agitate. And he is a big proponent of that. But one thing I would also note is that I think he felt like the one of the big gaps in American politics to this day is that even today, Black political figures still struggle to represent um, districts, states, wherever, cities that are not predominantly people of color. And that still is a kind of gap in our political system where it's still few and far between. You have a Wes Moore who's just, I think, the third Black governor ever elected post-Reconstruction era. You only have a handful of Black figures who've been elected statewide in Senate offices in this country. And I think he was just as concerned about that as he was about, um, just the sheer numbers. I think what he was also concerned about is what kind of representation, and are Black figures able to gain the support not just of Black voters, but of other parts of the electorate as well. And so I think he was very concerned about those things. But, I think there were a lot of political figures that he felt like understood the sort of energy, especially of younger people, which was really important to him. But I also think he was looking for people who really understood how to speak to, he came up in the sort of era of the Reagan Democrats, the time when, Democrats were losing blue collar, working class white voters to Ronald Reagan. And I think he has seen that erosion happening. And I think he was still sort of looking for the figures who understood how to address that and reverse that. And I'm not sure, I don't want to overstate this because his health has not been great of late, but I think he was still sort of looking for the emergence of a figure like that to come along.
Well, the book is Jesse Jackson and the Fight for Black Political Power. You can go pick that book up wherever books are sold. We'll have a link in our show notes for that. You said the word agitation, Phillip. You wandered right into my trap. I set it up for you beautifully. So I want to ask you before we let you go about CNN Newsnight, because I think a lot of people have been asking you this question along the book tour, but they've never been on those panels like I have, right? I've been on some of the shows with you where we've seen, some heated moments, and it kind of funnels a little bit into your book. You don't necessarily touch on it too much about talking to the other side. It was really more about Democrats, but your show has done this about talking to the other side. So I want to ask you first about your show and the criticism your show has been getting. I look at it more from a producer lens, right? Because I was a producer at a network. So I look at it more from a format perspective of 7-minute segment, 5 to 6 people. Maybe it's too much. But other people look at it more of who are the people sitting in those seats, right? In terms of, do they represent the true political spectrum that we have here in America? To those folks, what do you say in response about the format in the show and the intentionality of the show, highlighting voices across the way, like you say in the introduction of the show?
The point of the show is to actually have a conversation among people who have different points of view. And those different points of view are supposed to represent, as best as we can from night to night, what is actually happening in the country, the actual ideological spectrum and belief spectrum that we experience in the country. And I understand that some people don't want to hear it. They do not want to hear the other side. But that's not really what we're doing on the show. And I think there are plenty of other options if people want to have just one side of their perspective, left or right. But we are having a conversation, and that conversation, as we know in this country, is heated. It's a little messy. It's passionate. It matters because we're we're talking about people's lives here. And I think that that's, I mean, I think people get hung up on, oh, why is she letting so and so say this or so and so say that? And it's like, well, first of all, we have free will in this country. People are allowed to express their opinions. Um, Sometimes their opinions may or may not be factually accurate. To the best of my ability, I'll try to keep us on the straight and narrow on that. But I think some people, the truth is, they say that it's about whether things are true or false. But I think sometimes it's what it's really about is whether or not they actually want to hear what people who disagree with them have to say. And we don't apologize for that. Uh, that's not something that I think we shy away from at all. And I also think that there are a lot of people in this country who do appreciate the conversation because when people are watching at home, no matter what their political beliefs are, they should be able to hear somebody who reflects their point of view. And they do. And I hear that from them all the time. And I think that is super important is that this is a big country and we've got people with all kinds of different viewpoints. And when they turn on the television, I do think that they ought to be able to hear, okay, this person, I agree with what this person has to say. And then I'm hearing what this other person has to say, and I don't agree with that, but I've never thought about it that way before. And I think that dialogue is what we're trying to foster. And, you know, I mean, I don't mind. I guess there is some criticism, but I would also argue, Mike, I think that there are many people who appreciate it. And I know that because I hear from them all the time. And sometimes the loudest, most critical voices, especially when they're online, they get way too much weight, but they're not actually representative of what a lot of the country is experiencing. And I think people want more engagement and they want more dialogue. And that's what we're trying to give them.
Before I let you go, Abby, and let me piggyback on that for a second. Do you think you mentioned before about new media and Jesse Jackson running during his time, 3 networks, not enough to you really go on and saturate his platform and message. You think he would have sat in one of those seats in your show? And what would have the dialogue look like with, let's say, not even a Scott Jennings, because I think Scott Jennings is, yeah, I'll leave it there. But somebody worse than a Scott Jennings, right? Like somebody that is truly in the belief of like, we've got to get everybody out of this country. How do you think the Reverend would have handled dialogue with somebody like that? That's technically the other side in this equation.
I mean, I think that he would have been completely comfortable sitting and having that dialogue. He used to host a show on CNN called Both Sides with Jesse Jackson. And he had a television show that was sort of predicated on that. But even more to the point of the book, when you look at how he campaigned, where he went to places where people maybe would not have agreed with him. He was in Texas. He was in the Deep South. He was in rural parts of the country where there were people who literally thought that he was subhuman. They were out and out racists, or they had been at some point in their lives. In the lead up to the 1984 campaign, he went to Alabama and sat with the former segregationist governor of that state. And so Jesse Jackson was very practiced in going to places where people disagreed with him. He was in the business of talking to people who had differing views, of negotiating. And that's not even just in domestic politics. He would go and he would sit with foreign leaders in the Middle East who were holding Americans hostage and so on and so forth. Look, I think that he never had a problem with talking to people that he had disagreed with. And in fact, I think he really understood very clearly that there was a important job of persuasion in politics that he was responsible for being engaged in. And that if you're in politics, that is what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be able to make a case for why your view of politics is the better one. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't, I know that he watched the show. He still does when he has the ability to. And I know that he enjoyed it. I mean, I think that he believes in the dialogue. If there's anything that I've learned from reading and researching and talking to him, it's that he actually was a huge advocate of going where supposedly you're not wanted and talking to those very people who disagree with you and bringing them over onto your side. And so that is a lost art of our politics today. I think people are way too comfortable just singing to the choir, or preaching to the choir. And I think that is not what a democracy is supposed to look like. If you're only talking to the people who agree with you, then you're not really engaging in the work of democracy. And I think that's, I don't want to overstate it, because I'm not trying to suggest that we're doing it perfectly, but we are attempting to do it. And that process, that attempt, I think is extremely important.
Well, you convinced me, Abby. All right, you convinced me. I will say, I didn't know about the CNN show that he had back in the 80s. I forgot about that. But you can go check out not only tidbits like that, but more of the book about the Reverend Jesse Jackson and the fight for Black political power. And also watch weeknights, 10 p.m., my friend Abby Phillip, CNN Newsnight, if you want to get upset. She doesn't check her Twitters, but I will be responding to you if you get angry with her on the tweets.
And maybe you might see Mike on there. He's good. He's good at this. I don't know why. Yeah. You're pretty good. So,
well, thank you, Abby. I appreciate it. Abby, I can't thank you enough for hopping on the podcast. Continued success with the book. Please stay safe. Okay.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Hey, everybody. Mike Leon from the Can We Please Talk podcast. Thank you so much for watching this clip. Do me a favor. Hit subscribe. Gonna get more content from us over at Can We Please Talk.